I grew up in Ohio in the 70s, and my best friend Joe and I were always outside. Joe lived on a farm near a big forest, and my parents would drop me off there in the morning. We spent the whole weekend in the woods, only coming out for school. We pretended to be explorers, building shelters, making traps, and practicing making fire with sticks. When we were in high school, we got an idea from the movie Stand By Me. We decided to walk along the railroad tracks out in the country, looking for cool bridges to fish from and camping a little way off the tracks. We knew it was dangerous and probably trespassing, but we were kids and thought it was fun. We did this many times, finding beautiful rivers and hidden bridges, and nothing bad ever happened. After high school, Joe and I went our separate ways but stayed in touch. One summer in the mid-90s, we were both back in town for about a week. We spent our days with family and our nights catching up over drinks or sitting around a fire at Joe's house, talking about old times. One night, after a few beers, we decided to relive our Stand By Me trips. We planned to walk the tracks, camp for one night, and then walk back home the next day. My wife thought we were crazy but dropped us off at our old starting spot early the next morning. Joe suggested we walk in the opposite direction from our usual route, just for fun. We knew the land well and had a map, so we set off. The day went well, filled with fun and nostalgia. We found a bridge, sat on the edge, smoked a joint, and moved on. We didn't have fishing gear, but we brought some canned food. Before nightfall, we found a thickly wooded area to camp in, surrounded by trees like a tunnel. We set up small hammocks, but decided to scout the area first, like we used to. We walked about 100 feet into the woods and up a small hill. At the top, we saw an old building about 100 yards away. It was barely visible through the trees. We thought it might be a sugar shack, but decided to check it out. As we got closer, we saw it was an old church, abandoned for years. The wooden planks were black with moss and rot, and a weathered black cross stood on top. There were no windows, just open frames, and no doors, just open doorways. We didn't go inside, but could see rows of pews and a raised platform for a preacher. Feeling uneasy, we quickly went back up the hill to our campsite. Having the hill between us and the church made us feel better, but we were still a bit creeped out. As dusk fell, we decided to go to sleep and leave early in the morning. Night came, and as we lay in our hammocks, we heard something from the direction of the church. It sounded like singing. We both slid out of our hammocks and listened. The singing continued, but it wasn't getting louder. We decided to go back up the hill to see where the sound was coming from. We crept up the hill quietly, not using flashlights, and reached the top. We saw light coming from the church, flickering like candlelight. The singing sounded like church music but in a different language. We watched for a while, seeing only shadows inside. Then a booming male voice started chanting, scaring us even more. It sounded like an old preacher, but we couldn't understand the words. The chanting continued, followed by a loud, long wail that got louder and more disturbing. I covered my ears, and then it stopped. Just as I was about to suggest leaving, Joe put his hand on my shoulder and whispered that people were coming out. We saw a line of figures holding hands, walking out of the church, some with flashlights. They started singing again and moving towards us. We grabbed our stuff and ran down the tracks as fast as we could. After a few minutes, we looked back and saw lights moving erratically, like the people were shaking them. We kept running until we reached a road. By our map, we knew a small town was about 15 minutes away, so we walked there and found a 24-hour gas station. We called my wife, who thought it was kids messing around, but those voices didn't sound like kids to me. To this day, I don't know who those people were or what they were doing in that abandoned church. It was the creepiest thing that ever happened to me in the woods. But the story doesn't end there. About a week later, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease and curiosity. I needed answers. I convinced Joe to go back with me during the day. We drove back to the spot and hiked to the old church. As we approached the church in daylight, it looked even more sinister. The decay was more evident, and there was an eerie stillness in the air. We decided to go inside this time, feeling braver with the sun up. The interior was just as we remembered, rows of pews, the preacher's platform, but there was something new. Scattered on the floor were pages of what looked like old, handwritten texts. The language was strange, not English. While Joe was examining the pews, I noticed a small door at the back, partly hidden by the shadows. It was slightly ajar. I pointed it out to Joe, and we decided to take a look. Behind the door was a narrow staircase leading down into what felt like a basement. The air grew colder, and the smell of damp and decay was stronger. We descended slowly, our flashlights barely piercing the darkness. At the bottom, we found a small room with stone walls. There were symbols carved into the walls, and in the center of the room was a table with what looked like ritual objects, candles, an old book, and strange symbols drawn in a circle. The air was thick with a sense of dread. Suddenly, we heard a noise from above, like the sound of footsteps. Our hearts pounded as we turned off our flashlights and stood still, listening. The footsteps grew louder, coming down the stairs. We had nowhere to hide. Just as the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs, we heard a voice chanting, the same eerie chant we heard that night. In a panic, we bolted out of the room, pushing past whoever was there and running up the stairs. We didn't look back until we were outside, breathing heavily. There was no one following us, but we didn't wait to find out who it was. We ran back to the car and drove away as fast as we could. Since then, we haven't spoken much about that day. The memory of those chants, the figures in the church, and the strange room in the basement haunt me. I still don't know what we stumbled upon, but I know I'll never go back to those woods again. Well, friends, please subscribe to the Tales of Terror, as only a few of you did, or maybe you will face this situation as I did. In the summer of 2013, I was 21 and had just finished my junior year of college. My friends and I decided to go on an 8-day camping trip in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. There were 7 of us, 4 guys and 3 girls. We picked a campsite in a remote part of a big campground, far away from everyone else. The first few days were amazing. We went whitewater rafting, and it was a blast. We had plans to hike Mount Washington later in the week. We spent our evenings drinking by the campfire and messing around. Everything was perfect until the third night. It was around 9:30 p.m., and we had a big fire going. Suddenly, a disheveled man walked past our campsite. His clothes were torn and dirty, and his hair was a tangled mess. He looked like he was in his mid-40s. We didn't think much of it and assumed he was another camper taking a walk. About an hour and a half later, the same man walked by again, but this time he was moving slower, almost limping. We were pretty drunk by then, and someone might have yelled something at him, but he ignored us and kept walking. It was a bit strange, but we shrugged it off. We stayed up until about 1:30 a.m., then decided to go to bed. I usually sleep well when camping, but that night I couldn't sleep. I got up to pee in the woods and saw a faint light about 50 to 75 yards away. It looked like a dim flashlight. I went back to my tent and told one of my friends, who was still awake. We decided to check it out, but when we got there, the light was gone. Feeling uneasy, we went back to bed. Later that night, I woke up to a blood-curdling scream. It was Sarah, one of the girls in our group. I jumped out of my tent and nearly ran into her as she was running back, still screaming. She said she saw the man from earlier standing in the woods just 15 feet away from her, not moving. We were all freaking out, yelling and making a lot of noise. I tried to calm everyone down so we could figure out what to do. We decided to get out of there as fast as we could. We ripped our tents apart, threw everything into our cars, and sped away. It was around 4 a.m. We drove for a while until we found a diner that was open. We sat there, trying to make sense of what had happened. Some of us thought the man was a homeless guy camping in the woods. Others believed he was stalking us. We knew we couldn't go back to that campground. The next day, I went to the front desk of the campground with 2 other guys. We explained what happened. The staff believed us and said there were no other campers fitting the man's description. They refunded most of our stay, which was surprising. We decided not to let this ruin our trip and found another campground far away to stay in. 2 days later, we were hiking up Mount Washington. We started early and were halfway up when we saw the same man hiking down. This time, he looked different. His hair was neat and his clothes were clean. We froze and some of us screamed. He just smiled and walked past us. There were enough people around that we felt safe, so we continued our hike. But we couldn't shake the feeling that he had been following us. We finished the hike but decided to cut the trip short by a couple of days. Looking back, we're sure he was stalking us. It was the most unnerving and terrifying experience of my life. Seeing him on the mountain after everything that happened at the campground was beyond creepy. I still don't know what he wanted or why he was there, but I'll never forget the feeling of being watched and hunted. When I was 14, my family and I went on a camping trip to a state park. My friend and I were excited to spend our days exploring the woods and our nights telling scary stories around the campfire. But little did we know, our adventure would take a dark and terrifying turn. We arrived at the campsite and set up our tents. My friend and I decided to take a walk through the woods, a ritual we called the walk. We loved navigating through the dense forest using our flashlights to guide us through the darkness. But on this particular night, we decided to venture further into the woods than we ever had before. As we walked, the trees seemed to grow taller and the shadows deeper. We heard strange noises, like twigs snapping and leaves rustling, but we brushed it off as wildlife. But then we heard whispering, soft and low, seeming to come from all around us. We spun around, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was no one there. We tried to shake off the feeling of unease and continued our walk, but the whispering grew louder and more urgent. We stopped and listened, our hearts racing. And then we saw her, a woman crawling on the ground, her dark clothes blending into the shadows. She was whispering random words, her voice barely audible. We froze, our flashlights fixed on her. She looked up, her eyes locking onto ours, and stood up. "I'm looking for my campsite," she declared, her voice slurred. We exchanged a nervous glance and decided to help her. As we walked her back to the campground, she stumbled and staggered, her words slurring together. We finally found her campsite, but her friends were nowhere to be found. They had left her behind, unaware she was missing. We helped her into her tent, feeling relief and unease. As we walked back to our campsite, we couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. The next day, we saw her again, sitting by the campfire, her eyes sunken and her skin pale. She barely acknowledged us, her gaze fixed on something in the distance. We tried to avoid her, but she kept appearing, always lurking in the shadows. One night, we decided to take the walk again, hoping to shake off the feeling of unease. But as we walked deeper into the woods, we heard the whispering again. This time, it was louder and more urgent. We spun around, shining our flashlights in every direction, but there was no one there. And then we saw her, standing before us, her eyes black as coal and her skin gray as the trees. She was whispering, her voice growing louder and more menacing. We tried to run, but our feet felt heavy, as if rooted to the ground. She started to move towards us, her eyes fixed on ours, her whispering growing louder. We were paralyzed with fear, unable to move or speak. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was back at our campsite, my friend shaking me awake. "What happened?" I asked, my voice shaking. "You just collapsed," he replied, his eyes filled with concern. "We have to get out of here," I said, my voice firm. "We have to leave now." We packed our tents and left the campsite, never looking back. We never spoke of that night again, but the memory of the whispering woman stayed with me, haunting my dreams and making me wonder what happened in those woods. But it didn't end there. A week after we returned home, I started hearing whispering at night. It sounded just like her, soft and low, growing louder and more urgent. I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing her face, her black eyes staring at me. One night, I woke up to find her standing at the foot of my bed. She was whispering, her voice so loud it felt like it was inside my head. I screamed, and she disappeared. My parents rushed into my room, but there was no sign of her. The next day, I told my friend what happened. He admitted he had been hearing the whispering too and seeing her in his dreams. We were both terrified. We decided to go back to the state park to find out what was going on. When we arrived at the campsite, everything looked normal. We walked to the spot where we had first seen her, hoping to find some clue. As we stood there, the air grew cold, and the whispering started again. We turned to see her standing a few feet away, her eyes fixed on us. She started moving towards us, her whispering growing louder and more menacing. We backed away, but she kept coming. We turned and ran, the whispering echoing in our ears. We didn't stop running until we were back at our car. As we drove away, the whispering finally stopped. But the memory of her eyes, her voice, and her presence still haunts me. I don't know what she wanted or why she was there, but I know I'll never forget the whispering woman in the woods.